I'm Louise Leakey, and I live and work in Kenya on fossils, particularly looking for fossils of our human ancestors. And in fact, this work began with my grandparents at Olduvai Gorge in the 1950s, 1940s, and then continued with my parents, Meave and Richard Leakey, up at Lake Turkana in Kenya. And then I now lead this. So we've had multiple generations. So Lake Turkana is incredibly hot, dry. It's a semi-arid, let's say. Lots of rough and rugged hills, sandstones, lava, old volcanic ashes in certain places as well. And so it's really, the fossil sites have been laid down by an old lake basin. And so that water is flowing into that lake basin from rivers, from the highlands either side. And that water carries sediment, and the sediment buries the bones of animals that are living and dying there. So there's a lot of sediment that's accumulated over millions of years. And it's in those sediments that we look for fossils only when there's tilting and these old things get pushed back up to the surface again. And then these fossils become, they erode out of the hillsides, and that's what we've got to walk over to try and find the fossils. Now, we're particularly interested in finding fossils that are related to our ancestors. Where did we come from? And can we find the fossil evidence that help us to put that extraordinary story together that goes back 6 million years? To be out in the field, for us, we have a camp. It's a mobile camp so that we can move its location depending on where we're interested in working. So we'll spend, say, 3 months in one place, and we'll use that as our home. And then we'll go out to explore certain field sites from the camp. And the camp will therefore have places to charge your iPads and your telephones or your satellite phones with solar power. We then have to bring water, drinking water in particular, in from somewhere. And when we're close to the lake, we can actually use a reverse osmosis plant to filter and purify the water so we get good drinking water. The food and fuel and everything comes in from Nairobi, so that's a long way away. So we've got to actually truck everything in that we need. And we plan ahead for a 3-month expedition before we then dismantle the camp and then go back to base. So it's a comfortable camp. It gets very windy, but we're in canvas. We're under canvas tents. We have a couple of vehicles that we use to get ourselves to and from the sites. And the team of fossil hunters that are part of the group, they're all drawn from the local communities. So they're all on the east side of the lake, the Dasanich and Gabra communities that live there. And they are very good at finding fossils. If it wasn't for them and their extremely sharp eyes, we'd never find anything. We'd never be able to answer this. So it's a real team effort. A lot of fun to be out in the field finding these fossils. All the things that we're looking for have got to have come up onto the surface initially. So you'll walk over an area and you might spot a little piece of bone fragment. It's slightly blue and white. It's turned to stone. It's fossilized. It's not soft. But you've got to know whether it belongs to a pig or a hippo or an elephant or a monkey, say. And then you've also got to work out what piece of the animal it is. Is it a toe or is it a bit of tooth or skull? So you really need to have a good sense of what the different bones of different animals look like. And so when you find a piece of bone, you then say, oh, this is important. We can identify this to species level. And if it's useful scientifically, then we'd go through a process of collecting that. And that would involve then making sure you pinpoint exactly where that fossil comes from. Because if somebody else wants to get back to that site, you've got to be able to have given them the precise location. Because once you move a fossil out of context, it's meaningless. You need to know how old these fossils are. And that you need to then see which level it's come from. And that level you can then date using a radiometric dating technique, like carbon dating, but you're using different elements to date volcanic ash horizons that lie either above or below the fossil. So you've got to understand the complex geology and interpret that to be able to accurately place the fossil in terms of its age or its provenance. So that's how we do it. You've got to find these things. And then once you've found something and it is important, say you find the tooth of a human ancestor, there might be more of it there. And you may really want to make sure that you haven't left anything behind. And so that's when you put in a screen, you take all of the sediment and rock off the surface and you push that through these sieves, you shake away the dust, and then you go through carefully the things left in the tray, a sieve, and see if there are any fragments. And then you've got to sort through those, and eventually you may have everything that you could possibly have from that site, and then you can study the fossil. So there's quite a lot of time involved in finding a fossil, excavating it, screening the site, and then studying it to get it to the place where it's eventually published or described in the literature, which is then available for everybody to read and understand its context and importance. So, I grew up, spent all my life really following my parents around these fossil areas. As a young child, I found it quite boring, to be honest. It wasn't that exciting. I far prefer sitting on the lake shore and swimming with the crocodiles and things. We had to be very careful at the lake shore. But it was hot work, and you don't find things very often. So as a youngster, it's fun for a little while, and then it gets quite tedious. But so I was sort of patrolling, following along my, path with my parents. They'd gone past something. I sort of sat down on a rock and picked up a tooth and sort of casually said to them, well, do you think this is important? And they said, whoa, what is that? Where did you find that? Here, hand this over, move away. So that actually was a 17 million-year-old ape tooth at a site that we had visited briefly. So that was then quite exciting that I had found something of significance for a change. But I didn't really have much sense of how important it was until once they'd taken it off me. So we live amongst wildlife, and though now there's a lot more people and livestock in the areas that we work, there is still a little bit of wildlife. When I was young, we used to see a lot more of it. But you go to bed and you hear hyenas calling at night. They get quite curious. Sometimes when we find a fossil and you paint it with a hardener and you leave it at night for it to dry properly before you collect the fossil, if we don't cover the fossil with rocks to protect it, then these hyenas, for some reason, like the smell of the glue. And so we had painted a beautiful pig skull once with a hardener, hoping to come back to it in the morning. When we came back to it, it had been totally destroyed by a hyena who decided it would chew through it or scratch it to pieces. So I think one of the things that I've now come to appreciate is how any of the new fossils that we find, particularly of the human ancestors, can really have a big impact on how we perceive the story of our evolution in terms of how on earth did we come to be these 8 billion people on planet Earth. There is a remarkable story behind that. And until very recently, we didn't know much about that story and how much of that has taken place in Africa. So every person on planet Earth has an origin in Africa. And we only, as our species, moved out of the continent some 60,000 years or thereabouts ago. And we all descend from those groups that left at that time. And that's quite a remarkable thing. And if you think that at that time, there were also at least 5 different upright ancestors that coexisted, that lived together on the planet, why is it that it's just us here today? That is a truly remarkable story. And I think unless you can stop and look back in time and try to piece together this remarkable series of events that actually led us to being here today. I think that's something that most people don't stop to think about. And so I think that's what really inspires me, that every fossil you find could contribute to this remarkable story and our understanding of the past.